Last time I took you on a whirlwind tour of the history of interpretation, both Jewish and Christian, and it's time at the end of that we got up as far, believe it or not, as the Enlightenment with Spinoza and a passing blow at Luther and Calvin. There's much that we did not cover. There are volumes and volumes of history of interpretation now available if you really get interested in this topic. It used to be there wasn't anything out there, but now there are all sorts of multi-volume works on the history of Old Testament or New Testament interpretation. New Testament interpretation pretty much tracks Old Testament in the sense of methods used and how to apply them and so on, with some exceptions, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what is the takeaway from all of this? What trends do you see in this long survey of interpretation? One that we have already mentioned is that it's fairly clear that there are loops and eddies, movement back and forth in the interpretive tradition. It does not work, and this is a repetition of what I said in the last lecture at one point. It does not work like the sciences, where it is assumed that once you discover oxygen, oxygen has been discovered. And you don't go back and to a time when nobody knew about oxygen and so on. So it's not additive in the way that the history of interpretation works in the humanities in anything, and particularly so in terms of biblical interpretation. Biblical interpretation keeps moving forward, but there are times when certain suggestions in the past are forgotten, and then new things come up, and then the old ones are rediscovered again, and so on. So there is this sense of déjà vu that sometimes develops in the history of interpretation, and you should not be surprised by that. The way in which people interpret is influenced, and that's going to be another point, is influenced heavily by what's going on in the rest of scholarship. And if you really want an example of that, look at what happens in the humanities once Darwin propounds his theory of evolution. And in the late 19th century, practically every academic field is influenced by that idea. It obviously is not going to work in the same way as Darwin put it out there in the sciences, but the same principle is there. And people began to think in evolutionary terms, even in terms of religion. We'll see when we get to Wellhausen that Wellhausen had a notion that religions evolve in the same way that species evolve. So you can talk about primitive religions, you can talk about more highly developed religions, you can talk about superior religions that are at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and so on. None of that is later accepted in the 20th century by most people, but you can see what is happening. Conversation in the humanities is heavily influenced by what goes on in other fields, particularly in the sciences, not only in the biological sciences, but also in the anthropological and sociological sciences. Once people get the idea that you can actually study people who are not like us, it gets to catching the imagination of biblical scholars. And there is a whole movement that begins in the late 19th century where people are going out and looking at what they considered to be primitive societies, among which they would have put the ancient Hebrews. And said, well, we can find out all about them by going out and studying Bedouin in the middle of the Sahara, and assume that the early Israelites were like that. Well, no, you can't. That's not good practice anymore. Those societies all have their uniqueness, and they are by no means simple. They are complex and complicated, and you need to live with them for a long time. But we didn't get around to that insight until around the early 1940s or late 1930s. So people were using the idea long before they knew exactly how it was going to work out. So there's much of this kind of experimentation going on in the history of interpretation, and it will come as no surprise then to know that from about 1950 onward, for example, the advances in literary criticism, what was going on in departments of English, French, comparative literature, what was going on in those fields had a heavy impact on what happened in biblical studies. The biblical studies people pick it up about 10 years later after it's already old news in the comp lit department. The Yale deconstructionist school had deconstructed long before its influence was felt finally dribbling down into biblical studies, which thought it was new. Whereas in fact the founders of the movement had long since given up on it and were off doing something else by that time. So it's like the Sunday school curricula that I talked about earlier. There's a lag time before these things finally make their way to the more general public, and you have to be aware of that. Who knows what the next phase of biblical studies is going to be. We already know where it has been, and the kinds of things that it is doing don't necessarily match up with what's going on elsewhere. That leads us to a second point about the history of interpretation. At all stages of the history of interpretation, the interpreters reflect the social and intellectual context within which they are working. And so Philo of Alexandria, for example, writing about the Jewish past and about Jewish religion and thought, is living in a thoroughly Hellenized culture down there in northern Egypt. And it's no great surprise that he brings that kind of philosophical reflection into his treatment of ancient Israelites. So he will give you something that is thoroughly influenced that way. When we have a new introduction of classical thought in Spain, courtesy of the Arabic texts that are preserving and translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts, once that moves into the West in the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages, it will heavily influence the way that Jewish and Christian thinkers begin to do their work, and for that matter, the Muslims are being influenced as well by these Greek currents which had been lost in the West. I mean, they still existed further to the east, but they're being transmitted in Arabic. They're not being transmitted anymore in Greek. It took a while to recover the Greek texts and to begin to use those in the original study of these currents of thought. So Plato was first read in Arabic and begins to influence in Spain hundreds of years after this major classical influence that gave us Philo, for example. So all of these interpreters are heavily influenced by their contexts, and anyone who tells you that it's only in the last 100 years that we have been influenced by our context, and somehow before that there was a kind of pure interpretation which was much closer to the text, is just sheer nonsense. No generation interprets texts in that way. And we've already said that the whole point of interpretation is to make it answer the questions of the community that is doing the interpretation. And each community has its own questions that come from its own cultural setting, and that's why they are interested in the interpretive process in the first place. Without that interest, there would be no interest in interpretation. The text would not have anything to tell us. It could simply be read on the flat and read aloud, and everybody would nod and say, yes, now let's get on to something else. So it is this need of each generation with its own cultural problems, its own historical setting, its own theological ideas, its own social ideas. It's up to each generation to do its own interpretation. And this is why, let me remind you again, we cannot give you a definitive interpretation in this course. I'll tell you what I think about it, and you'll read what some authors think about it. But it's up to you finally to do your own interpreting, which is why we are so anxious to have you learn what interpretation is about and how to go about doing it on your own. You're really going to be on your own, and you will eventually wind up in some kind of setting, whether it's an academic setting or a liturgical setting or simply the fabled educated layperson who is going to be doing your own interpretation. So that's the reason for going through this kind of a course. So it has always been done that way, and each generation and each group has to come up with its own interpretation. So what keeps it from drifting off into the direction of Aspinwall's efforts of making the Cromwellian revolution to be related in some way or another to Daniel 7, and making Cromwell the one like a human being who came on the clouds with all of the messianic overtones that image carries, both early and late. What keeps us from drifting off into Never Never Land when we do the interpretation? Well, there are two things that we saw in the history of interpretation that give us some hint of how that works. The first is we noticed that every time interpretation seems to begin to drift away from the text or to rise above the text, there come a number of different counter moves who decide that the interpretation is drifting too far away, and therefore that it needs to be brought back in conversation with the text itself. So the text, and I mean this quite literally, remains a fixed item. The text is what it is. And just as in the sciences, theories and hypotheses are tested against the original work. You never take the word of an experiment that claims that it has shown something without testing it again against the data. And interpretation works in exactly the same way. I don't want to over-dramatize this because I've already said that interpretation of literary works does not work the same way as the sciences work. But this is a case where it pretty much does. If you read the beginning of Ezekiel, the first chapter of Ezekiel, where he has a vision in which he sees what turns out to be, as it gets closer, an enthroned divine figure of some sort, which is thoroughly identifiable to anyone who has read about the temple in Jerusalem. Once you see it, if somebody says, well, obviously what is going on here is we've got a flying saucer. They just didn't know what those were. And we do, having seen them ourselves. There was a woman during the flying saucer flurry in the mid-1960s who wrote into the New Haven Register saying that she was not at all a bit surprised that there were flying saucers. One had been coming over her house in West Haven for years, every night, and she was finally glad that the rest of the world had caught up to her. So if you begin to read chapter 1 as if it has to do with flying saucers, somebody is going to look at that and say, now wait a minute, let's take another look at chapter 1 and see what it is really describing. Will this interpretation hold up against the text which it is supposed to be interpreting? And if the community's answer is no, that doesn't make sense to us, you're through for the day. That interpretation is not going to survive, which of course is what happened broadly in England when the Cromwell incident was finally over and the monarchy was restored. People looked at it and said, no, we really don't think Cromwell was the one like the Son of Man who is coming on the clouds, and we don't think this is a very good interpretation of Daniel 7, that we ought to come up with another interpretation of Daniel 7. So interpretation is constantly having to run up against the texts that it interprets, and it's the text itself which remains fixed. That does not mean the text is clearer. It just means that it's fixed. You've got to go back to it and come up with something else that is going to fit better with your perceptions of what is going on, and the next generation will do exactly the same thing. Sooner or later, what we think and say about the text will be last year's news, and somebody else will have a different set of questions and do it differently. So the text struggles toward specificity and accuracy in interpretation, but it does not necessarily discover an unchangeable truth in the text. That's an ongoing project that groups continue to be engaged in. So it's the one thing that keeps us anchored, as it were, is the notion of return to the text. The text continues to be what it is we are interpreting. So we are not free to leave it behind. We can't say, well, now we got that taken care of. We need to move on with something else. So it's always the text that remains the anchor and the point to which interpretation will eventually return. And you saw any number of examples of that in the history of interpretation that I was quoting for you. Every time the allegorists look like they are about to drift off into Never Never Land, there will be a Karaite movement, there will be something, or there will be a Jerome, somebody who comes along and says, now wait a minute, this does not look like the text that we have in front of us. And so there is this trend away from and back toward the text, which remains a fixed item. The second thing that you saw that keeps us from floating off into Never Never Land is the acceptance by a community of faith. And this is a very mysterious kind of project. How this works, we're not exactly clear. It has something to do with expectations of the group, but you have all experienced it in one way or another. You will hear an interpretation, maybe it's a sermon, maybe it's a comment that is made, and it suddenly resonates with the group and says, yes, that is the way I see it too. So there is a kind of communal approval which follows good interpretation, and without the approval of the community, it is very hard for interpretations to fly off in new directions. There is a kind of historical anchor, if you like, that has to do with the community itself. It's most common, I think, in listening to sermons, where everybody eventually, when they listen to a particular sermon, says, yes, this is the Word of God to this community at this time. And it becomes persuasive, and in Christian terms, the gospel is being preached when that occurs. And people recognize it within the community. They may not have expressed it in the same way, but they recognize the phenomenon. And so it's important to get this kind of communal support because it is on behalf of the community that interpretation is taking place. If you do this, you are doing it for a community of which you are a part. Now, that means that it's going to be hard, again, within the broad categories of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, to talk about a definitive interpretation, because different groups are going to have different ideas about how this works. And just they may share a text, but they do not always share an interpretation of that text. And it seems that that's simply what we have to live with. There is no way around it. What we need to do is find the Word of God through that text for our community at a given time. That's the challenge that interpreters all face. And the tendency or the possibility of drifting off the mark is there always and very marked. All right, having said that about what the history has shown up to this point, we are now in historical terms up as far as the Reformation in the Christian West. Remember that nothing like that happens in the Eastern Church or in those other smaller Christian groupings. They are going on their own way, and we need to keep reminding ourselves of that. What's happening over in Eastern Orthodox churches is not the same thing as is happening in the West in the Catholic Church, for example. So there are great differences in the Christian world. Same thing is true in the Jewish world. That group of people that clustered in Spain and moved off in certain philosophical and theological directions in their interpretation, the people like Maimonides and Ibn Ezra, those people eventually go south and down into Africa, most of them. Others are quite happy doing what they do in Europe. In France, Rashi pretty much takes over the role as the primary Jewish interpreter for Middle Europe. But again, we have to remind our Jewish colleagues that that's not all that was going on in interpretation in that period. You've got people, you got Maimonides, for heaven's sakes, down in Egypt writing Guide to the Perplexed. That's a whole different world from the world that Rashi inhabits. And the interpretation that is provided by Maimonides is quite different. And it is a very different community. And we have to keep reminding ourselves, is one right and the other wrong? No, they are contextually speaking to different communities. And we always have to remind ourselves of that. So let me now indulge in a little oversimplification for you. But a simple point needs to be made here, and that is that not all Jewish and Christian communities are interested in the same parts of Scripture. Having talked for most of the course so far about the Bible, particularly the Hebrew Bible, as if it were a single thing, we now need to finally admit that different communities of interpreters have different ideas about the utility and the authority of different parts of the Bible. This is particularly obvious when it comes to the Christian community. The Christian preferences in this are very clear from the New Testament itself, and they have not changed substantially since the New Testament was written. Christians have always valued most highly, when they're thinking about the Old Testament, the writings of the prophets and the Psalms, for obvious reasons. Both of them are interpreted as predictions of Jesus as the Messiah. They are reading, incidentally, and you need to remind yourself of this when you see it in the New Testament. Notice how many times that a psalm is taken to be revelatory about what Jesus is doing. It's not just Isaiah or Micah or someone like that that is in the prophetic line. They are interpreting the prophecies or the Psalms as prophetic. And they're doing that because David, by that period, is thought to have written the Psalms under prophetic inspiration. And therefore, when the writer of the Gospel of Mark goes to describing what happens in the Passion narrative, he goes for guidance in what events took place to Psalm 22. And he literalizes Psalm 22 in his narrative describing the events of the Passion. So he's reading the psalm as a prophetic document and seeing it fulfilled in the same way that he saw other parts of Jesus' ministry fulfilled when prophetic texts were involved. When it comes to the Pentateuch, the study of which we are now beginning, when it comes to the Pentateuch, Christians tend to be interested mostly in the introductory narratives, Genesis 1 through 11. Mostly because these chapters, and we'll talk a bit about this later on when we get into them specifically, these chapters are aimed at explaining the world to you. If you really want to know about reality and how the deity relates to the world and how humans relate to each other, these are the chapters where the writers of our text are trying hard to explain what they perceive reality to be in their own terms. We will see that not all of the people who had their hands in that narrative agree about this. We'll see some differences of opinion, and that has troubled our modern interpreters for a very long time. And when you ask, well, is it this way or is it that way, they're not interested in that question in antiquity. What they're doing is passing on the views that people held about these issues, and they are terribly important issues. In modern literary terms, we tend to use the term myth to describe this material, which is unfortunate because we think of myth today as being something which is untrue. That's not what the word means when applied literarily. It means those thoughts of a civilization about what, as the philosophers would say, is really real. That is, if you want to know what the nature of humankind is, this is the first place you go to look at that, how the ancient Israelites looked at that question and what they thought about it, what they thought was worth passing on to future generations about the world and how people act in it and how the deity relates to it. And this is fundamental. This is the root of their thinking about the deity and about the world. So Christians are still interested in that. And there's a great deal of Christian interest in those first 11 chapters. Once you get beyond that, Christian influence, or a Christian interest rather, in the Pentateuch wanes a lot. They really don't care much about the ancestral stories that follow this and make up the rest of Genesis. They begin to take notice again when we talk about the Exodus from Egypt and the deliverance of the people from Egyptian bondage, but once they're through with that story, that's pretty much it for the Pentateuch, as far as Christians go. And if you begin to look at lectionary readings, you can see how that plays out in the kinds of materials that get read and that get celebrated liturgically. Beyond the narrative of Exodus, people don't much care. There's all this legal material beginning around Exodus 20, and outside of Exodus 20 itself, which is the Ten Commandments, which most Christians say still makes the cut when it comes to interest in legal material. And we'll come to that when we go through the Ten Commandments. People are still generally in Christian circles in favor of the Ten Commandments, which is good to know. They don't really care about the rest of it. There's all sorts of interesting stuff. In fact, Calvin tried very hard to get everybody to read the Ten Commandments from Deuteronomy, where it appears as well. And he said, you know, you can jump all the way from the crossing of the sea to Deuteronomy and not miss anything. He was fortunately unsuccessful in convincing people of that reading, and so people read it twice in different contexts and then worry about why it is different in the two contexts. And we'll get to that. But there is a slight interest in that, but generally the Christian take on legal material, which is all the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, and up through the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers before the narrative resumes. The Christians are just not interested much in anything but the narrative. The world is a lot different on the Jewish side. Jews, on the other hand, have viewed Scripture differently. They, of course, admitted the authority of prophetic literature and the writings, but the rabbis who generated the Mishnah were most concerned with the Pentateuch and the name which they gave it, the Torah, or the teaching in Hebrew, suggests its importance and the importance that they attached to the legal sections, particularly those found in Exodus and Leviticus. The narratives of the Pentateuch were of less interest to them, although, unlike the Christians, who decided not to read liturgically those sections which are not of interest to them, the Jewish community nevertheless reads the entire Torah at least once a year and has been doing this at least as far back as we can track. Either on a one-year cycle or a three-year cycle, every word of the Torah is read liturgically every year. And the reading begins with Genesis 1 and continues without jumping around all the way to the end of Deuteronomy, when, and we'll come back to this later on as a theological assertion, when the last words of Deuteronomy are read in the synagogue, and everybody celebrates the reading, completion of the reading of the Torah, the first words of Genesis are read again. So it is a never-ending cycle. One is never through with the Torah. And that's an important theological issue, which is reflected in the way that liturgy is done and put together. And that incidentally was characteristic of the Jewish interpretive literature, which I pointed out to you when we read the Mishnah. The Mishnah presents all of the different opinions on an issue. They accept usually one of them as being the one that they think is the appropriate interpretation, but all of them are presented. They don't tend to do what Christian interpretation does, which is eliminate all of the ones that didn't make the cut. So a Jewish reading will give you all of the possible interpretations and let you make up your own mind whether the rabbis did it correctly or not. And even, according to a famous story, even God cannot change that. The rabbis once, according to the Talmudic story, were reading in the legal material, and they came up with an interpretation. And God, through a heavenly voice, said, "No, that's not right. That's not what I had in mind. Rather, I had this." And the rabbi said, "It does not matter. It is not in heaven," was their famous line, which is to say that, you gave the Torah to humans, and it is now theirs, and it is theirs to interpret. And what they say about the interpretation of it is what it is, and even the deity cannot now take it back and indulge in this original meaning interpretation. It doesn't matter what the deity meant, as far as they are concerned. The Torah is now with humans. And it seems to me, interpretively, that's a really good thing to take away from the text, that the text has been given to us. And so it's now ours to interpret. and we better do a good job of it. All right. Neither Jews nor Christians, then, give equal weight to all portions of the Torah, but both used its contents selectively for religious purposes and as a source of teaching, law, and doctrine. The Pentateuch, or Torah, I'll use those terms interchangeably whenever you hear them. For the moment, at least, you understand that they refer to the same thing. The Pentateuch early on was attributed to Moses, although a statement of Mosaic authorship is nowhere made within the Torah itself. A possible exception to that is the very ending of Deuteronomy 31, where we get the words that'll come up again in a minute. Moses wrote this Torah. And what it probably refers to is the book of Deuteronomy itself, which constantly uses the word Torah to refer to what it does. So Moses is probably being said to have written Deuteronomy, but if you want to argue with that, you may do so. In spite of the fact that we don't have this explicit doctrine of Mosaic authorship, it is clear that as early at least as the 2nd century BCE, we have a tradition of God, well, at least as early as the Chronicler, whenever you think the book of Chronicles was written. There was a tradition of Mosaic authorship that was widely accepted in Jewish circles, and probably on the basis of that Deuteronomy passage, if nothing else. We get that, and by that time we also have the tradition of the 5 books of the Torah, or 5/5 of the law that make up the whole. They do recognize that there are differences, and in particular we'll see they recognize differences in the book of Deuteronomy, that is somehow different from the rest, in the same way that Christians recognize that the Gospel of John is different from the 3 synoptics, which resemble each other rather closely. But the whole of them make up the Gospels. So also they recognize Deuteronomy as a kind of separate category, and we'll come to that later on and spend some time with Deuteronomy. All right, so Mosaic authorship seems to be an idea that is in the Jewish community early on. It is also very clear that early on the interpretive tradition of the Pentateuch recognizes that there are problems talking about the unity of the Torah. That is to say, they recognize, reading it much more carefully than we have done, that there were items in there which did not seem to fit, or in interpretive terms, there were bumps along the road of interpretation. There are things that cause you to raise questions as you try to read through the text. And you pretty much know what is involved. Both the narratives and the legal sections, for example, seem to contain duplicates and occasional contradictions. One of the most obvious is at the very beginning, which we'll spend some time on this. Genesis 1 and 2 appear to contain 2 different accounts of creation. Later on, the flood story contains 2 different accounts of the number of pairs of animals taken into the ark. You will worry about that later on in the discussion groups. Some narratives discussing creation use the personal name of God, which is usually pronounced Yahweh. The 4-letter name is written up there for you, Y-He, Vav-He. It is not pronounced by observant Jews. We don't really know how exactly it was pronounced. Our guess is based on Greek transcriptions of it into Greek, which is already a step away from the originality of whatever the Hebrew text is. Whenever it appears in Hebrew text as early as Qumran, It usually is not written out in full, but abbreviated with a yod, which is the first letter of the word. It is pointed by the Masoretes, indicating the pronunciation of the text, to be read with the vowels Adonai. So they want you, when you read it liturgically, to say Adonai, which means Lord, rather than to pronounce the name itself. That convention then gets followed in practice up to this day. So it is a perpetual reading within the text of Hebrew text of Scripture. This name, the four-letter name, is introduced in the second chapter of Genesis and used throughout the rest of the book. And yet, later on, you get other names for the deity being used in Genesis, including the name Elohim, which is an odd version of the generic name for deity in Hebrew and Semitic generally. The normal word for a deity is El, or Elu, or whatever Semitic language you're speaking. This one looks like a plural, which has been the subject of much ink that has been spilled. No one has a good explanation, except biblical usage always uses it in that plural form to refer to the God of Israel, who is unquestionably a single deity. So we're not talking about, if they pluralize El, they pluralize it Elim, which is the correct plural for it. This looks very much like an Aramaic word of some sort with that middle H in there, which is a way of expanding a hollow week for those of you who are in the throes of learning Hebrew right now. It makes no sense whatsoever as a plural. The best guess is it is a plural of majesty, as when Queen Victoria says, "We are not amused." Things like that, but nobody really has any explanation for why the form looks the way it does, except any time you see it in the Hebrew Bible, it does refer to the God of Israel, and if they're talking about other gods, they use the word El or the plural Elim. So there is a certain consistency about it, but it is the alternation between these two words. And the persistence of using Elohim in chapter 1 of Genesis as if the four-letter name was not known, whereas chapters 2, 3, and 4 all suggest that the name Yahweh was known from the very beginning. And when we get over into Exodus and God's confrontation with Moses at the burning bush, you will be told that this is the revelation of the private personal name of God, Yahweh, as if the name had not been in use in Genesis. This has puzzled lots of people. The rabbis, of course, not surprisingly, had stumbled on this problem, and they said, well, they mean different aspects of the divine being. So the personal name Yahweh has to do with God's compassion and graciousness. Elohim has to do with God's power. Well, that's fine, as long as you define it that way from the start. There's no evidence that that's true. There's nothing inherent in the words. There's something else going on here, and it has been a puzzle. Certainly, both Jewish and later Christian interpreters caught on to this and puzzled about it. By the Middle Ages, there were other explanations that began to be offered. Ibn Ezra, one of these great Spanish medieval scholars who developed, noticed that Ibn Ezra has an Arabic name, indicating the power that Arabic as a language had in Spain at that time. So he takes it would be Ben Ezra in Hebrew. So he insists on using his Arabic name, Ibn Ezra. And he writes a commentary on Deuteronomy. And on the very first verse of Deuteronomy 1:1, he says this, and I'll close this kind of introductory lecture on this note, and you can puzzle over it. I will tell you what it is in a minute, but I don't want you to go the whole weekend wondering what is going on. But he writes this, "And if you understand the mystery of the 12, and Moses wrote, and the Canaanite was then in the land. In the mountain of Yahweh it shall be provided, and behold, his bed was a bedstead of iron. You shall understand the truth." That's all he says. Now, I don't have time to let you ponder that a minute and come up with something. I've often thought that that would make an interesting exam question, and put that on there and then say discuss. We will never do anything like that. So let me tell you what he is hinting at. If you understand the mystery of the 12, refers to the 12 verses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which talk about the death of Moses. Obviously, Moses did not write them. Somebody else wrote them. The rabbi said it was Joshua, but we don't have a change of speaker indicated there. Or that, yes, Moses wrote them and was writing at God's dictation, the rabbis say, but Moses was not really happy about what he was hearing, about how the story ends, and so on. But those are the 12, the mystery of the 12 that Ibn Ezra is referring to. And Moses wrote comes from Deuteronomy 31:9, and that I just referred to. And Moses wrote this law and gave it to the Levites. Obviously, that's a comment from a third party describing the actions of Moses and is not likely to be something Moses wrote. The Canaanite was then in the land is from Genesis 12:6, but you knew that. And it seems to be from a time when the Canaanite is no longer in the land, which means it's got to be a lot later than the time being described in Genesis 12. In the mountain of Yahweh it shall be provided is a little trick. That's from Genesis 22 as an etymology for the mountain on which Isaac is almost sacrificed. And it would have been read by the rabbis as referring to the mountain of the temple in Jerusalem. The mountain of the temple, and the temple itself has not been built at the time the story takes place. And there's no indication that the text is speaking prophetically here. So it's one of those anachronisms of the Torah. And his bed was a bedstead of iron, is a reference to the bed of the mighty Og, a sort of mythological hero figure of some sort, who is being introduced in Deuteronomy as if for the first time, when in fact in the Torah he's already known from Numbers. And you already know all about Og. If you really want to press it, I doubt that they knew this, but the text is also predating the Iron Age, which is to say that you're still at the end of the Bronze period when this story is supposed to be taking place with the people running around in the wilderness and so on. They don't know about iron yet, and yet here is the reference to iron as a usable product, even though probably a very expensive one. In the narrative, it's things like this that kept the rabbis awake late at night, and they are hinting here in Ibn Ezra's comment that Moses really did not write all of the Torah. And you can see why he does this in the Middle Ages. He does this in a riddle. With the Enlightenment coming, which is where we ended the story, it freed Christian scholars from the control of the church. And the suggestion that different names and duplicates and contradictions reflect different literary sources used by Moses to write the Pentateuch became an alternative explanation. And this will begin the debate within Christian circles of a very long discussion of how the Torah came to be what it was. In Jewish circles, this debate, outside of a few people like Ibn Ezra, gets dropped and does not come back again until the 19th century in Jewish circles, when most Jewish circles, let's put it that way, when the Christian work on the Torah begins to influence what's happening in the Jewish community. So we'll drop the Jewish line of the story briefly for a while, and when we resume on Monday, we'll talk about what happens interpretively in the explanation of these problems within the Pentateuch.